Hello, historians, and welcome to On This Day in History, your daily insight into what's happened in the past and how it's influenced the events of the present. Because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, a short look at what happened today, the 22nd of June, on this day. First of all, 1535, Cardinal John Fisher is beheaded on Tower Hill, London, for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as head of the Church of England. This all has to do with the Reformation and, of course, Henry VIII's break from Rome, which has been discussed in previous videos. But I think events like this do not get recognized as often as they should, or remembered as often as they should. There were people who stood up to Henry VIII. However, this is what happened to people who stood up to Henry VIII. Now, it is important to realize that not everyone simply did what Henry VIII told them to do. So it's important to remember that Cardinal John Fisher stood up for his own beliefs. He did not believe that the king could replace the Pope as head of the church. He was a Catholic, a staunchly Catholic man, and would not accept the new rules of the church. It's important to know that people stood up to Henry, but at the same time, when Cardinal Fisher is beheaded on Tower Hill, that makes the likelihood of other people standing up to Henry shrink, makes it go down a little bit. So you can see why people didn't stand up to Henry, because this is what happened when you did. So this is a good example of exactly how Henry VIII was able to use fear, intimidation, and terror to keep himself in power. On this day in 1633, Galileo Galilei is forced to recant his Copernican views that the Earth orbits the Sun by the Pope. So even though he had looked upon the heavens, even though he had a telescope, even though he was a learned man, he looked at it and he said, yes, Copernicus was quite right. I promise you, Earth is not the center of the universe. We actually go around the sun. This was deemed to be blasphemous by the church because, of course, God made earth for man, and we are made in God's image according to the church. And suggesting that the sun is the more important body in the sky rather than earth would be to suggest that God did not think that mankind is super, super special and didn't build the universe for us. That's the opposite of what the Bible says, so it must be wrong. You have to take it back. And the interesting fact about this, not so much that he was forced to do it, although as interesting as that is, this is, of course, hundreds of years ago. People did very strange things in the past. But the interesting thing to admit is the fact that the Vatican, the official office of the Pope, the office of the head of the church, Catholic Church, if you will, only admits that it's wrong about the universe officially on October 31st in 1992. So it took them a while, but they got there eventually. As spoken about in previous videos, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo today, 22nd of June in 1815, was his official abdication, his official acceptance of his defeat, and his official end of his reign, if you will. There was still technically a chance that he could rouse some supporters, get another army together, have another go at it, but after this, that is no longer a possibility. In 1848, on this day, the June Days, an uprising in Paris by French workers. Now, this is just a continuing theme, but in particular, in 1848, there were many uprisings around Europe, including places like Berlin, for example, with workers demanding their rights. I just point this out because there is a history of violent protest throughout the world, throughout Europe, throughout the United States of America, and of course we see that presently in our current world with a lot of protests against the government. This has a very, very long history, and in fact, generally speaking, the protesters, the further through history we get, the more you realize that what they were upset about had some value, just to keep that in mind. On this day in 1911, and this is our portrait here, King George V was officially crowned King of Great Britain and the Commonwealth. So this, of course, included Australia and New Zealand and Canada and India. the entire British Empire. Essentially, at that time, King George V was pretty much the most powerful man on planet Earth. How things would change very, very soon, of course, with World War One. And on this day in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany and its allies, keep in mind, Nazis had allies in Europe. So Nazi Germany with some of its allied forces invade the Soviet Union, and this is the largest military operation in history of all time, bigger than D-Day, bigger than Operation Desert Storm, the largest military operation that's ever happened was Operation Barbarossa, and it took place on this day in 1941. And it is indeed the subject of our deep dive of the day. Now, whether or not you know the details, whether or not you know the specifics of this particular operation and how it influenced World War II, we're going to look at why it was done, why it didn't necessarily succeed, and how influential it was. So we can see the main points of attack. This was a three-column attack with three objectives in mind. 1, the city of Leningrad. 2, the city of Moscow. And 3, the city of Stalingrad. Okay. Now, why attacking in those directions? Well, these are symbolic places in the Soviet Union. Leningrad is named after the founder of the new communist state, Vladimir Lenin. So taking Leningrad would be very, very symbolic and would help to establish the fact that the government has failed. Taking Moscow, obviously, this is the center of government, the capital of the nation. This was the idea that the same thing they did in France. If we can get Paris, we get France. If we get Moscow, we get all of the Soviet Union. And Stalingrad, well, there's a couple of things going on there. One, it's named Stalingrad, and it's Stalin versus Hitler. And two, it is on their way to another objective, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this was on this day, 22nd of June, 1941. So they launched the largest military operation in history. This goes across 2,900 kilometers or 1,800 miles for those who still use a silly imperial system. More on that in previous videos as to why kilometers is correct and miles need to go. Anyway, more than 3 million soldiers. Now keep in mind, there are entire countries that don't have a population of 3 million. There are entire cities that don't have a population of 3 million. This is 3 million soldiers marching into enemy territory, whilst they are also engaged in operations in North Africa, operations in Europe. They've just solidified their control of places such as France, for example. So this is a huge operation. Now, it was perhaps the most decisive moment of World War II, perhaps. Up to this point, Germany had absolutely dominated the continent with a series of successful military occupations and alliances. They had been pretty much unstoppable with the small, well, not relatively small, but with the unable to force Britain to capitulate, which will be spoken of in future videos as well. But for all intents and purposes, the German army had been unstoppable. Okay, so as they go into the Soviet Union, it was incredibly successful at first. It was on its way to Moscow, as I say, on its way to Leningrad, on its way to Stalingrad, and it is making ground absolutely getting many thousands of miles into the Soviet Union. The Germans believed that they were going to win. But unfortunately, they had not been able to actually capture Moscow by the end of 1941. Now, for those of you watching in the Southern Hemisphere, I will remind you that summer in the Northern Hemisphere is June, July, August, and winter is December, January, February. So if you have not defeated Russia by the end of 1941, it is now about to be winter. Winter in Russia is not a good time to have millions and millions and millions of soldiers engaged in war. So The winter allowed the Russians to launch counteroffensives, and the Germans were never able to take that initiative again. They did have some successful counterattacks of their own, but they were never able to gain the momentum that they had had from their initial attack in Operation Barbarossa. And the failure of this invasion essentially sealed Germany's fate, because it was the Russian army or the Soviet army that would sweep the Germans further and further and further back. And the race to Berlin towards the end of World War II to force the Germans to surrender was won not by the Western Allies and their D-Day landings in France, but instead by the Red Army, by the Soviets themselves, pushing from the east, and made it to Berlin first. So this is a popular meme, if you've seen this one on the internet. Now, I should make one correction. The meme says how people think World War II was, and it shows the gigantic Tyrannosaurus of the United States defeating the Central Powers of Italy, Japan, and Germany. How it really was, it shows Nazi Germany being absolutely overwhelmed by Russian forces. Now, the thing I'm going to correct on this is that word there, how people think World War II was. This is how Americans think World War II was. I'm sorry if you're an American listening to this, but World War II did not go the way it did in the movies, okay? Just because Americans make the most movies showing Americans doing the most winning in Europe, that was not necessarily the case. Were they an important part? Of course they were. Did they have incredibly talented soldiers who made incredibly brave sacrifices? Absolutely. But no, the Americans did not win World War II in Europe by themselves. And in fact, they were not the most influential force in Europe, as a matter of fact. Did they absolutely tilt the balance towards the Allies? Yes. Were they absolutely crucially to be involved? Yes. Did they absolutely come to dominate the war in the Pacific? Yes. But no, they did not dominate the war in Europe. This is an important fact that we must understand. So, it was the most disastrous theater of war in human history, this war on the Eastern Front, this war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. 26 million civilians died alone in this war through things like starvation and bombing of cities, being caught in the crossfire, if you will, and absolutely just a devastating war across the land. You can imagine Germany's pushing forward and attacking. There's a Russian counterattack that means there's explosions, bullets flying everywhere again. Germans push back, Russians push back, or Soviets push back. This is going on and on and on for a number of years, and it also saw the construction and formal beginnings of the mass extermination of Jews in the Holocaust. It was partially due to the Einsatzgruppen, which was a German word for basically death squads, that marched or operated behind German lines and went through the civilian population hunting Jews, literally just pulling them out in villages and shooting them and putting them into mass graves. That is how the Holocaust began. And the Germans, in perhaps the most devastating and frightening display in World War II in regards to the Holocaust, decided while this was killing a lot of Jewish people, it wasn't killing enough Jewish people. Hence, they created the death camps. Hence, they created the massive train transport of Jews to these camps to make sure they could kill as many as possible in the most efficient way possible, which is unbelievable and incredibly, incredibly tragic. More people died fighting on this Eastern Front than in any other theater of World War II. Without question, it was the war against the Soviets that cost Germany and the Nazis more soldiers, material, and equipment loss than against anyone else. So we must understand this. It was the war against the Soviets that cost the Nazis, cost the Germans the most amount in terms of their material, in terms of their generals, in terms of their soldiers, their military equipment, than against anyone else. So that brings us to the question, why do it? Why attack the Soviet Union? If you know that it's this vast, vast, vast land, and you have the chance that once winter sets in, you most likely will be defeated. Why would you do it? Well, one thing is they thought they would win, and very quickly. Blitzkrieg had been unstoppable at this point. It had seen the Nazis storm through France. It had seen the Nazis storm through Poland. It had seen the Nazis storm through places even such as Denmark and the Netherlands. They had and defeat the British Expeditionary Force and push them all the way back to Dunkirk. They had seen no major opposition. As far as the Nazis were concerned, Blitzkrieg was unstoppable. And when they looked into the east and they saw vast, vast territory of relatively flat terrain, relatively easy to maneuver terrain, in the summer at least, they believed that they had a distinct advantage. They had the best tactics, they had the best generals, they had the most experience. They would not be stopped. As I said, the only thing that had stopped the advance of the Nazis through Western Europe was, in fact, the English Channel. Had that not been there, well, we'll never know, I suppose. But they genuinely had a confidence that their land forces could not be stopped. Now, this is another thing. They had originally scheduled the invasion of the USSR for the middle of May rather than the second half of June, but they had to fight in Yugoslavia and Greece in April, so they had to postpone the Soviet campaign for a few weeks. Now, this is very important because that is what led to them still fighting in Russia towards the end of 1941. Had they had an extra 5 weeks, that would mean, say, for example, instead of getting almost to Moscow by the end of 1941, they're almost to Moscow by the end of November. But also the fact is, they would have had better weather, better conditions for that first 5 weeks as well. Meaning, if you're not doing 5 weeks worth of advancing through December, and you're doing that through May, you're doing that through June, you're doing that through July and August, perhaps that extra 5 weeks would mean they'd literally would have had Moscow defeated by September, October, or November of 1941, which would have been an incredibly different ball game, shall we say. So they genuinely believed they could do it, and in fact, they had invaded these two areas in the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula, the Yugoslavia, and Greece, and basically defeated both of those nations within 5 weeks as well. So this was yet another example to them. They're like, oh, well, sure, we had to do that extra invasion, but it only cost us 5 weeks because Blitzkrieg is unstoppable. Until, of course, you run into Russian winter, which this image is depicting that the Russians have an extra advantage. Essentially, their weapon of war, if you will, their most valuable commander is General Winter. If you are trying to invade Russia, don't ever do it in the winter. I can't stress that enough. But there's also the fact that Hitler doesn't trust Stalin. Now, believe it or not, this is one of those ones that gets lost in history. At the beginning of World War II, Hitler and Stalin weren't necessarily allies, but they had agreed not to attack each other. So when Hitler invaded Poland September 1st in 1939, starting World War II, which I'm sure you all know, 2 weeks later, the Soviets actually invaded Poland as well from the other side. They had agreed to split Poland and the Baltic states. Now, this was an agreement that had helped Hitler because he knew, and the Germans, because he felt that once they invaded Poland, the only people who could stop them were the Soviet army. They had an agreement, we'll split Poland, we won't attack each other, no problem, which had allowed Hitler not only to take that land all the way across to the east and split off across halfway of Poland, but then he could turn his forces around and start attacking in the west. Hence his ability to defeat France in a month, because his forces were not preoccupied in the east. So it was only after they had defeated their Western rivals, if you will, or subdued them and felt no threat from them, that they felt they could attack in the east. Now, this attack was also seen as, well, Stalin is just buying time. No matter what, he is going to attack us eventually. Either the Western allies of France, Britain, and later that year, the United States were going to convince Russia or the Soviet Union to attack German forces. So we better attack them first whilst we can, whilst we have this amazing opportunity to save that from happening at a later time. There was also this problem that Hitler hated communism. He had vowed to destroy communism in Germany. It was one of the reasons he had become popular in the first place in 1933. People saw him as a tough guy against communists. Now, there is some debate as to whether or not he actually was really strictly against communism, or if he was just using them as a political maneuver, as a scapegoat, if you will. But there was pressure, because he said he hated communists. There was pressure from Germany to take out the communists, destroy them once and for all. Communism was seen, or Bolshevism as they called it at the time, was seen to have emerged from the Soviet Union, from Russia, and this was a way of destroying it once and for all. And there is this other reason, this practical reason. They were trying to get to Middle Eastern oil fields, and they could only do this by going through the Caucasus Mountains in the Soviet Union, which means also going through Stalingrad, for example. And this was at the same time they were trying to attack through North Africa. They wanted to get to the Middle East. If they could get to the Middle East, they could secure their oil supply. That would help their military remain able to be deployed. They wouldn't need to worry about supply lines. They wouldn't need to worry about conservation of resources. And they would also have taken away oil from their enemies, from the Allies, as well as put themselves in a very powerful position. If Britain could not get their oil from the Middle East, for example, they would not be able to fight. And Hitler thought that taking the oil fields would not only help his army, but it would give him a very valuable and powerful negotiating position to try and take Britain out of the war as well. So this was also seen as a way of winning their war in the West. If they could get through the Caucasus Mountains, if they could get through North Africa, get to the Middle East, take control of the oil, they believed they could win. Now, it's very hard to imagine anyone fighting a war for oil in the Middle East, I'm sure, because we've never had an example of that in history before or since this time. And of course, I'm being sarcastic there. But even in World War II, Middle Eastern oil played a very important role. So this is how it goes down. We must remember that the most important reason for the defeat of Operation Barbarossa was the resistance they met from the defenders, from the Soviets themselves. They fought incredibly bravely. They fought incredibly hard, and they did so from a stance of pure patriotism, but also the need to survive. Now, by this, I mean the Germans had completely underestimated the fact that the Soviets would fight so hard. In World War I, the Germans had been able to defeat the Russian army. And one of the reasons they were able to do this was every time they had a major victory, they saw the morale of the Russian army deplete. They saw the will to fight go down. And the Russians ended up leaving World War I, surrendering to the Germans, if you will, and negotiating a peace treaty that was very beneficial to the Germans at the time. There was a belief that they would be able to do this again. Once we smash their army, once we have this decisive victory, their morale will be gone. They will give up. That will be that. Okay? But this was something they did not count on. Stalin called on the patriotism. We are going to defend Mother Russia. They are here to annihilate us. You're not just fighting for me, Stalin. You're not just fighting for communism. You're not just fighting for my government. You are literally fighting for your life, and you are literally fighting for the survival of your nation. So this was a very powerful propaganda tool that convinced more and more people to volunteer, more and more people to support the war effort. And it meant that no matter what happened in terms of defeats for the Soviets, they did not suffer that lack of morale in the same manner that they had in World War I. Now, this would be especially true in Stalingrad, where the fate of the world in many ways was decided in World War II. But there will be more to that, more to come about that in future videos. So on this day, Operation Barbarossa begins, the largest military operation in history, yet ultimately an unsuccessful attempt to defeat the Soviets. Do not ever invade Russia in the winter. So with all of that said, I hope you've learned something today. See you tomorrow.